Carla Lowe was born December 10, 1961, and was described by her sister as a good and generous person. In 1983, 21-year-old Carla was living in Pompano Beach. Tragically, on November 13, 1983, she was found deceased in Delray Beach, Florida, near a train station just north of Atlantic Avenue. She had been beaten while waiting for an Amtrak train. Detectives said they searched the area for hours but never found anyone who had seen or heard anything suspicious. Without any further leads, the case would go cold. Then, in 2021, Detective Todd Clancy worked on the case with former detectives from the department and utilized new technology. They were then able to find the suspect. Using new fingerprint technology from UK-based Foster and Freeman Company, it allowed a fingerprint to be identified from a piece of evidence left at the scene. However, police would not name the piece of evidence, saying the case was still under investigation. The device used to crack the case is known as Recover, and it is able to develop fingerprints on difficult surfaces and even from items that have been cleaned to prevent identification. 38 years after her life was cut short, 59-year-old Ralph Williams was arrested for her murder in Jacksonville, Florida on November 30, 2021. He had been a person of interest in the killing for quite some time and was actually arrested the day of her murder on grand theft auto and burglary charges, but could not be connected by evidence to her death. Williams' criminal record shows more than 20 arrests across Florida on charges like burglary, resisting an officer with violence, and robbery with a gun or deadly weapon, among others. Police have not determined a motive yet, but say that some of her belongings were taken and there is no connection between Williams and Carla, and he remains behind bars at the Duval County Jail and will be extradited to Palm Beach County where the murder occurred. Mary McLaughlin was a mother of 11, described as friendly, trusting, and a happy-go-lucky person. On September 26, 1984, the 58-year-old grandmother spent the evening playing dominoes and having drinks in the Henlin pub, now called the Duck Club, in Glasgow, United Kingdom, in an area known as Glasgow's West End. Her daughter, Catherine, had to leave the pub early to catch a bus home and didn't know this was the last time she would see her mother alive. Mary was seen leaving the pub at 10:45 p.m. to walk less than a mile home to her flat in Partrick, where she lived alone. On the way, she made a stop at the Armando's Chip Shop on Dumbarton Road, where she bought cigarettes and fritters and appeared in a happy mood. A local taxi driver who knew Mary, as we may, stated that she walked in front of his taxi carrying her shoes and her hands and a man following behind her. This man, believed to be Graham McGill, struck up a conversation with Mary and walked her back to her Crothy Court block on Laurel Street. Mary's daughter reported that sometimes her mother would invite people back to her flat when she had been drinking. Days earlier, McGill had been granted a weekend release from prison. He had been convicted of rape in 1981 and was in his final weeks of a 6-year sentence, which had been cut in half due to good behavior. He allegedly killed Mary that night and using her keys, which have never been recovered, to lock the door behind him and then returned to prison the next day. 5 days after her death, her son Martin and his then-girlfriend, June Brittle, showed up to her flat for a visit and was shocked by a horrible smell. He kicked the door in June, who has since passed away, entered the flat and discovered the crime scene and came out screaming. Mary's cause of death was strangulation, but with little information beyond this, the case would go cold. Over the years, there were several attempts at developing a profile of the suspect that were unsuccessful. Then in 2019, experts decided to untie a knot in the ligature and examine the area of the knot that had been protected from contamination all those years. That's when they were able to develop a DNA profile that did not belong to Mary. When the profile was run through the Scottish database, police finally had a suspect, Graham McGill. His DNA profile was also found on a cigarette butt, on Mary's dress, and on a bra that he took from the flat, which was later found in a nearby garden. After McGill's conviction, he was also jailed for life in 1999 for a brutal assault with intent to ravish, but released on parole in 2007. On December 4, 2019, 59-year-old sex offender McGill was arrested at his home for Mary's murder. During the investigation, his ex-wife said that in 1988, he confessed to killing a woman he met in a pub after going back to her flat and then threatened to kill her if she ever told anyone. Although he got to live free for 35 years, He was ordered to be imprisoned for at least 14 years. One of her daughters, Gina, wrote a book about her mother to keep her memory alive, titled Diamonds and Pearls. It is named after a lyric in her late mother's favorite song, Little Things Mean a Lot by Kitty Collin. Mary's family waited a long time for justice, and hopefully McGill's arrest will provide them some form of resolution. Nancy Jane Doherty was born May 24, 1948. In 1986, she was a mother of 2 living in Chisholm, Minnesota, and worked at a local nursing home as an aide. She also volunteered as an emergency medical technician for the Chisholm Ambulance Service. On July 16, 1986, at the age of 38, her boyfriend dropped her off at home just after midnight. She had plans to move to the Twin Cities the next day to attend school to become a paramedic. When her boyfriend could not get in touch with her, he asked law enforcement to do a welfare check at her home. That's when they found her deceased inside. She had been physically and sexually abused and strangled. Evidence indicated that a struggle had taken place inside and outside her home. Police would find male DNA from bodily fluids and under her fingernails. Witnesses said that they had heard a woman screaming in the early morning hours but did not report it. DNA was recovered from the scene but did not match anyone in the criminal DNA database. Over the years, authorities compared over 100 DNA samples from potential suspects, but none resulted in a match. According to old news articles, the case was complicated because Nancy had hosted a party to celebrate her daughter's high school graduation shortly before her death, so there were lots of extra fingerprints and DNA around the house. In 2020, the Chisholm police contracted with Parabon Nanolabs and had hopes of developing new leads using public genealogy databases. This led investigators to Michael Allen Carbo Jr. He was 18 years old at the time of the murder and had lived within a mile of Nancy and went to school with her children. Agents started surveilling Carbo and retrieved trash bags he had thrown into a dumpster outside his Lincoln Square apartment where he lived alone. Taking swabs of paper towels, facial tissues, Q-tips, a beer can, and a slim fast bottle, analysts were able to develop a DNA profile that was consistent with that of the suspect from 1986. Investigators then obtained a DNA sample directly from Carbo with his consent, which again confirmed the match. 52-year-old Carbo was then taken into custody and booked into the St. Louis County Jail in Virginia on probable cause of second-degree murder with $1 million bail. Police say Carbo was never on their radar and hadn't committed any high-level crimes that warranted his DNA being put in the state database. He has lived in Chisholm ever since the murder happened. He has 2 daughters who live in the region and has maintained steady employment nearly 3 decades, most recently working full-time as a care provider at a Chisholm facility for people who suffer from mental illness or brain injuries. He was convicted of burglary charges in 1988 and 1990, in addition to being charged in 2002 and 2007 for careless driving and not having insurance. He allegedly abused drugs and alcohol when he was younger, but has not had any problems with substance abuse in nearly 20 years. Garbo's supervisor at work described him as reliable, friendly, and an outgoing person. His former property manager called him polite, respectful, and fun. Longtime family friends said they'd never seen him angry or violent even when he was drinking or upset. One of his daughters even stated that he was the best father a girl could ask for. His friends said he would help anyone in need even if he didn't know them. This is the first Minnesota cold case solved through the use of genealogy databases, and Carbo is trying to fight it along with the removal of his garbage by detectives as being a violation of his constitutional rights. As of today, he remains in jail awaiting trial. From 1990 to 1999, a serial rapist would terrorize homes in Myers Park, North Carolina. He would break in and sexually assault the females living at the home. During the 90s, the suspect had become dubbed by the media as the Myers Park rapist. Police say these cases were investigated extensively, and of the 15 cases detectives have connected, 13 of them involved victims under the age of 18. The ammo used by the suspect was unique and similar in nature in nearly each case. In the majority of the cases, he would arm himself with a knife, break into the home, and move the victim to a different location. The initial reported sexual assault happened on June 13, 1990 on Maryland Avenue. The last reported assault occurred on Highview Road on January 9, 1999. With the help of the Sexual Assault Initiative Grant in Parbon Laboratories, forensic genetic genealogy testing allowed police to narrow their suspect list to one person, David Edward Doran. However, Doran died on June 24, 2008 at the age of 67. Officials credited the department's sexual assault cold case unit, which started in 2006 with developing a suspect through a DNA profile. Police in the 90s had trouble identifying a suspect because he wore a ski mask and gloves and he would leave very little evidence behind. The suspect's race also couldn't be determined because some victims thought he had a Hispanic accent. The investigation picked up again in 2006 when the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department formed its sexual assault cold case unit. Police believed that Doran would be responsible for as many as 50 sexual assaults across the country because he also lived in California, Texas, and Ohio. Police believed Aaron was 49 when he committed his first reported sexual assault in Charlotte, North Carolina, and believe he most likely began his assaults at a younger age. Although he didn't live in Myers Park, his distant family said he was a cat burglar who broke into homes during the night in the area. In 2001, he was convicted for possession of burglary tools, but the DNA sampling database didn't exist then. He was charged with assault to inflict serious injury, but was found not guilty in 2004. He was also charged with a felony for offering a bribe in 2005, but that was dismissed. According to the lead detective in the case, Doran's name never came up during investigations in the 90s. Another suspect, Gilbert McNair, was also dubbed the Myers Park rapist when he was called in 2009, which led Doran's victims to sadly believe that their attacker had been arrested. McNair was convicted of raping 2 women between 1990 and 1997 on Crescent Avenue and also used similar break-in methods as Doran, but there was a difference in the ages of their victims. McNair targeted women 21 to 28 years old, while Doran attacked mostly minors. Thankfully, now Doran's victims now have some closure. Andrea Michelle Bowman was born Alexis Miranda Badger on June 23, 1974 in New Orleans, Louisiana. Her teenage mother was promised by Catholic Charities that her baby would be well cared for by a good family. She was placed in foster care at 5 months old with Dennis and Brenda Bowman of Virginia and would be adopted by them at 21 months old. They would eventually relocate to Michigan. When Andrea was 6 years old, Bowman went to prison for 5 years for intent to perform criminal sexual assault when he attempted to lure and assault a woman in a wooded area in western Michigan. The 18-year-old woman was riding her bicycle when Bowman approached on a motorcycle and tried to force her to walk into the woods. She was able to escape when someone in a truck pulled up to help. He was also the suspect in abducting a 6-year-old girl, and his wife supported him through it all. He also had a criminal record even before adopting Andrea, which disallowed him from being able to join the Navy, but was somehow able to adopt a child. In 1988, at age 14, Andrea told her guidance counselor at her high school that she was fearful of going home. The school involved law enforcement who interviewed her, and she told them Bowman often molested her. However, a social worker returned Andrea to her home and confronted her parents about the allegations. And of course, they refused the allegations, claiming that she was just being rebellious after finding out that she was adopted. Shortly after the allegations were made, the family would move to a very rural area in Hamilton, Michigan. On March 11, 1989, Bowman reported Andrea missing, claiming that he came home from work and noticed that she had stolen $100 from the home before running away. His wife Brenda later increased the amount that was missing to $150. That was enough for police to issue a warrant for Andrea's arrest for larceny, and the warrant listed Dennis as the victim of his daughter's alleged crime. With no foul play suspected, the police quickly classified her as a runaway and passed her case along to the Youth Services Bureau. For the next several months, her adoptive mother made several calls to police in which she stated she had been told of numerous sightings of Andrea, leading to the belief that she was a runaway, though these sightings could not be substantiated. Sadly, Andrea would be dismissed as a runaway for the next 30 years. In 1993, just like Thomas Dean Gibson from my 5 Cold Cases in Oregon video, she was one of several missing children whose photographs were shown in the music video for the Soul Asylum song Runaway Train. In 1998, 10 years after she went missing, Bowman was arrested for breaking and entering the home of a coworker to steal items, including her lingerie. Before his sentencing in the case, he referenced his missing daughter in a letter to the presiding judge saying, "I am the father of two lovely daughters, one 25 and the other 11, and feel that being a parent is one of the most important and sobering things a person can undertake." In November 2019, Dennis Bowman was arrested for the 1980 murder of Kathleen Dull in Norfolk, Virginia. He was extradited back to Virginia in February 2020 to face charges in Dull's murder after DNA linked him to her sexual assault and murder 30 years earlier. In May 2020, he was also charged with Andrea's murder. Prior to his arrest in 2019, the Bowmans went to police to complain that Andrea's biological mother was harassing them and accusing him of her murder. Police took the water bottle that he left at the police station and tested it for DNA. That is how he was linked to Kathleen Dull's murder. Once arrested, he also confessed to other crimes. It wasn't until 2019, after he was arrested in the Virginia cold case, that Brenda supposedly learned what really happened to Andrea. During recorded phone conversations from jail, Bowman described to his wife that he killed Andrea. Several days later, it was announced that skeletal remains had been recovered on 136th Avenue in Hamilton, Michigan, concealed by a thin layer of cement. In order to determine if the victim was indeed Andrea, they tracked down her birth mother, Kathy, who in turn provided her DNA, proving the remains indeed belonged to Andrea, or Alexis as her mother had named her. In February 2021, Bowman's wife testified at a preliminary hearing that her husband confessed to her that he murdered Andrea more than 31 years ago. He stated that he came home on March 11, 1989 to find Andrea had packed a bag and was threatening to tell someone he was molesting her again. He said he slapped her and she fell down the stairs, and so he hid her in a barn before he decided to report her missing. Later, he buried her in the backyard. He said he then reburied her after moving from 4249 Lincoln Road in Holland, Michigan to Hamilton, Michigan as soon as they signed papers on the land. Brenda Bowman testified that Andrea told her one morning that her dad had molested her, and Brenda said she told her she was a liar. Bowman is serving 2 life sentences in a Virginia prison after pleading guilty to raping and killing 25-year-old Kathleen Dull in 1980. In November 2021, Bowman decided to plead not guilty to Andrea's murder, and the trial will apparently carry over into 2022. Shockingly, years after Andrea's disappearance, he taught Sunday school to kindergartners at church as a sex offender. It is speculated that he committed many other sexual assaults and even murders. As of today, Andrea thankfully has her name back and her alleged killer is behind bars. In the 1980s, the community of Eugene, Oregon were baffled and horrified by a string of murders of several women. At the time, they didn't know that it would take nearly 4 decades to find who the monster was that took their lives. On June 5, 1986, the body of 62-year-old Gladys May Hensley was found lying on the floor of her apartment in Eugene. Her apartment showed signs of forced entry and there was evidence of a sexual assault. 2 weeks later, the body of 33-year-old Janice Marie Dickinson was found beneath a tree behind a car dealership's parking lot. Her murder was sexually motivated as well. Detectives believed that the cases were related, but had no clues that could lead to a potential suspect. While police were investigating the 2 women's murders, a man was arrested for attempting to burglarize a woman's apartment in Springfield in the middle of the night named John Bollinger. According to the woman, she had heard her dog barking and went to go check, only to find him peering through her kitchen window. She ran towards the living room and called police, and while she was still on the phone, Bollinger entered the house and attempted to yank the phone from her hands. The woman then started attacking him with the phone and flashlight, causing him to cower to the kitchen and flee, leaving behind a vest and a kitchen knife. A sketch was soon released of him in March 1988. Not long after, Bollinger was arrested and interrogated about the crime, during which he claimed that he had simply knocked on the door and walked away, but as a result of amnesia, could not remember anything after this point. He was subsequently found guilty and given a 5-year prison term. He remained at the Utah State Prison until December 8, 1987, when he was paroled for good behavior, despite already having an extensive criminal record. In 1980, He was arrested for murdering 33-year-old Casey Sorensen in her home at 8044 West 3500 South in Salt Lake City, Utah. Bollinger claimed that he and the victim were having consensual sex that accidentally led to her death, causing him to panic and flee. At the murder trial itself, the main focus was to determine whether Bollinger had strangled Casey intentionally or accidentally. To support their claims that it was accidental, defense attorneys brought in testimony from Dr. Boyd Stevens, a San Francisco-based coroner who said that the woman's death was the result of heart failure caused by compression on her chest. District Attorney Len Payne countered the claim by saying that Bollinger had strangled her after she allegedly insulted him. A judge sentenced Bollinger to only 5 years in prison once again, and he was released on parole on March 7, 1986. Bollinger was paroled to his hometown of Springfield, Oregon, just 3 months before Gladys Hensley was killed. On February 27, 1988, 3 months after his second release from prison, Bollinger broke into the home of 73-year-old Geraldine Spencer Tuohy and murdered her. Geraldine was found the next day by her sister. On March 23, 1988, Bollinger committed suicide at his home in Springfield less than a month after killing Geraldine. At the time, police only knew that he had a history of breaking and entering and that he had taken his own life. He wasn't even a suspect of the murders of Geraldine, Gladys, and Janice. It wouldn't be until the year 2000 that DNA connected the murders of Geraldine, Gladys, and Janice to the same killer. But police still didn't know who the DNA belonged to at the time, and their cases would go cold until 2016. It was then that the Eugene Police Department contacted Parbon Nanolabs, who created a snapshot of the suspect based on DNA extracted from the crime scenes. They received more than 100 tips, but none of them panned out. Over the next few years, police investigated all possible suspects, eventually narrowing it down to 4 people, one of whom was Bollinger. After extensive investigations, they excluded the other suspects via footprints and fingerprints. In February 2022, after 6 years of extensive DNA testing and genealogy research, the Eugene Police Department announced at a press conference that John Charles Bollinger was identified as the killer of the 3 women and that the cases are now officially closed. Janice Rose Bullock, known as Jan, was born in August of 1950. As an adult, she was living in Pearl River County, Mississippi, had 4 daughters, and was going through a divorce. She would end up losing custody of her children to their father in 1974 when she failed to show up for a court hearing regarding the divorce. After this, she never saw her 4 children again. Her family last heard from her when they got a letter from her sometime in 1976. On May 28, 1977, she was personally served in Pearl River County, Mississippi, where they summoned to a appearing court in regards to the custody case. Jan was reportedly working as a waitress at the Dickey's truck stop on Highway 26 in Poplarville, Mississippi. Indications are that she continued to work there until early to mid-1978. After leaving the county in 1978, she apparently worked at various locations on the Gulf Coast and then she disappeared. The circumstances of her disappearance are unclear, but there was no indication of her whereabouts since 1978 until recently when she was shockingly found alive in a Fort Worth, Texas nursing home. For unclear reasons, Jan wasn't reported missing until 2017 when one of her daughters filed the report. Her 4 daughters had been searching for answers for years and submitted DNA in an attempt to find her. In December 2021, investigators discovered that Jan was working in the Raceland area of Lafourche Parish, Louisiana in the late 70s or early 80s at a place called Dupe's Bar. In January 2022, Mississippi Coast Crime Stoppers asked the public's help to locate Jan, and someone contacted investigators about her late husband, which led to a possible son living in Texas. Her son, David Streety, was located in Texas and authorities met with him on February 12, 2022. They looked through family photos and possessions, which led them to believe Jan had been living under an alias since 1980. He told them his mother was in a nursing home in Fort Worth and her true identity was confirmed the next day. It has not yet been announced what alias she has been using for the past 40 years. David says he was adopted by his parents from Charity Hospital in New Orleans right after his birth. He says his mom told him she had no living family when questioned about relatives. Despite his shock and anger, David says he still loves his mom. He says Jan and her late husband gave him a good life, and he had a great mother but is now looking to find his birth family. He added that he never had an idea they were not his biological parents and even wonders if he was possibly kidnapped. He is also interested in meeting Jan's 4 biological children that she abandoned before allegedly purchasing or kidnapping David. He was told that Jan and her husband purchased him for $1,000 from his biological parents and raised him as their own. He now doesn't know if that is true and he can't find any records of being adopted. He says his plan is to send his DNA to 23andMe and see what happens. After some speculation that Jan must have left her husband due to abuse, his daughters Mindy and Mary Beth posted on Facebook that their father, although not perfect, was never abusive to his children and raised all of them the best he could, and he remains supportive of them. Lynette Ladner, who is one of Jan's 4 biological daughters, said she has spoken with her mother and thanked Detective Mark Ogden for his hard work to bring this case to a close. She declined to elaborate further, only saying that her mother is ill. Authorities are looking to speak to anyone that knew Jan any time after the late 70s or early 80s, especially in and around Lafourche Parish, Louisiana. This will definitely be a case to continue following for updates. From December to February 2006 in Volusia County, Florida, authorities believed they had a serial killer on Volos and dubbed him the Daytona Beach Killer. 3 women were all found shot and left throughout secluded areas of Daytona during that 2-month period of time, and then 2 more afterwards. All but one of the women had a history of prostitution, were unclothed, and had been killed the same way. On Christmas Eve 2005, 45-year-old Laketta Gunther and her friend Stacy Dittmer made plans to cook Christmas dinner together. However, Laketta had left the apartment that day and never returned. The next morning on Christmas Day, Stacy went searching for her friend. At some point, she noticed some police investigating something in an alley on Beach Street. She would later find out that they were investigating the death of her friend Laketta, who had been killed and left wedged between 2 buildings in a filthy alley. After her death, Stacy put together a poster signed by her friends to hang in the alley, and ironically, one of those signatures belonged to the killer's next victim, Julie Green. Julie Green was 35 years old when she was found on January 14, 2006 on the edge of a construction zone at what is now the Bayberry Lake subdivision off LPGA Boulevard. Julie often hung out at a popular bar in the area called Willie's Place on Madison Avenue, just like Laquetta. On February 24, 2006, there was another victim, 35-year-old Iwona Patton. She was found near Mason and Williamson Avenues. At the time, it was a wooded, undeveloped area, but now it is an entrance to the Daytona Beach Police Department's headquarters. Iwona worked as a nursing assistant and lived in the Holly Hill area. Nearly a year later, 30-year-old Stacy Gage was found in a wooded area off Hancock Boulevard. Stacy was a mother of 2, and although unlike the others, she had no history of sex work, but her murder was similar in nature to the other 3. Police do not have DNA or ballistics evidence from her case to tie her death to the others, but investigators have said due to the similarities, they believe she is definitely linked. Years later, on March 7, 2016, 32-year-old Rachel Bay was found just off the Beeline Highway, about a mile north of Indiantown Road in Palm Beach County. No clothing or identification was found near her. Unlike the other 3 women, Rachel had been strangled to death, and the same DNA was found during autopsy. Using the suspect's DNA profile, genetic genealogists were able to determine who the DNA most likely belonged to and gave his name to investigators. Those investigators then watched the suspect and were able to collect a cigarette he had discarded while waiting on a bus near his home. The DNA was a match to the killer and belonged to Robert Tyrone Hayes. He was a student at Bethune-Cookman University at the time of the slayings and lived on North Flagler Drive in West Palm Beach. He had also worked at the university in the past and at one point held a security officer's license. His home is less than a mile from where Rachel's body was found, and her cell phone pinged near his home for days after her death. He also lived in the area where Julie, Laketta, and Iwona were last seen before their deaths. According to records, he has also lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, Riviera Beach, Florida, Atlanta, Georgia, and Daytona Beach, Florida. Hayes was questioned twice by investigators during the initial investigation into the Daytona Beach murders because he owned a .40 caliber gun. He bought the gun in early December 2005, not long before Laquetta was shot on Christmas Eve. In March 2006, Hayes told police he had given the gun to his mother, but during his trial, she denied this ever occurred. Police said Hayes also reported a .40 caliber firearm as being stolen from his vehicle in Riviera Beach in December of 2006. In 2019, Hayes was arrested for the murder of Rachel Elizabeth Bay. DNA found on her body matched DNA from Julie and Laquetta, and ballistics tests connected him to Iwona's murder. On February 22, 2022, Hayes was found guilty of murdering Laquetta, Julie, and Iwona, and will be tried separate for the murder of Rachel Bay. Thankfully, Hayes is behind bars where he belongs and will no longer be able to prey on women. Mary Catherine Edwards was born July 9, 1963 to Lamb and Marianne. In 1995, at the age of 31, she was a beloved and vibrant second-grade teacher living alone in Beaumont, Texas. She had a large circle of friends and a close-knit family and had just moved into a townhouse at 1005 Park Meadow Drive. She was last seen on the evening of Friday, January 13, 1995. After work that day, she arrived home, walked her dog, had a glass of wine, and talked to her boyfriend. However, the next day, her parents grew concerned when she did not respond to any phone calls. They went to her home to check on her, and her father was shocked when he found her in her bathroom. She had been murdered and sexually assaulted. Over the next 26 years, Beaumont police investigators partnered with the Texas Rangers, FBI, and the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office to follow up on tips. In April 2020, investigators began using genetic genealogy to help find a suspect. There was remaining evidence from the crime and several items were sent to Othram, where scientists eventually developed a DNA extract that was suitable for advanced DNA testing. The DNA was entered into GEDmatch and second cousins were identified. The Texas Rangers Unsolved Crimes Investigation Program worked with Beaumont Police, led the investigation and creation of family trees and the searching of public records to identify the unknown male from the crime scene. As additional distant family members were discovered, further DNA samples were taken, leading to more than 30 DNA files being voluntarily submitted. With DNA connections from both the paternal and maternal sides of the unknown suspect, he was finally identified as 61-year-old Clayton Bernard Foreman. However, investigators needed Foreman's DNA to finalize the connection and started collecting trash from Foreman's home in an attempt to collect his DNA. When they finally had a sample, it positively matched the DNA found on Mary Catherine's body and the handcuffs at the scene. He was then arrested, and in September of 2021, he was indicted for the capital murder of Mary Catherine. Foreman, who was living in Reynoldsburg, Ohio when he became a suspect, was a former high school classmate of Mary Catherine's, and they were considered to be casual friends at the time of her murder. They both attended the same high school, and she was even a bridesmaid at the wedding of Foreman and his first wife. Additionally, investigators say that the crime against Mary Catherine had similarities to a 1981 sexual assault in Jefferson County of another of Foreman's former high school classmates. In July 1981, he came across a stranded woman at a gas station in the pouring rain and saw that her car was stuck. He offered her a ride home and gained her trust by lying and telling her that he was a police officer. Once in the car, they drove away and he later stopped the car, bound her hands, same as Mary Catherine, and then sexually assaulted her while holding a knife to her. Foreman, a no-good waste of space, pleaded guilty to the crime and only received 3 years of probation. 14 years later, he would murder Mary Catherine, and there's no telling how many other sexual assaults or even murders he committed over the years. Shockingly, former classmates of his stated that he helped organize the Forest Park High School reunions and attended the last one in 2018. He was even in charge of the reunion tributes to former classmates who had died. Gerald Ray Osborne, who went by JR, sadly went missing at the age of 35. In 2012, he worked for Spear Aero Systems and lived alone in an RV park at 209th West Avenue in Sand Springs. Oklahoma. He was last seen at the Walgreens pharmacy in Owasso, Oklahoma at 5:35 p.m. on August 28, 2012. The next morning, his blue 1994 Oldsmobile Cutlass was found locked and abandoned in the roadway near Cincinnati Avenue and East 63rd Street in Tulsa. It was towed, but no evidence of foul play was discovered. Records show that his cell phone was used through the early morning hours of August 29, 2012, after which all activity stopped. This is the same day his car was found. Although he had previously struggled with drugs, he had been clean for 2 years by the time of his disappearance, and his family never believed he would have abandoned them. Investigators at the time believed he had possibly met with foul play. He would go missing for the next 10 years until a man was hiking near Oak Cliff Drive on February 15, 2022, and discovered human remains in the remote area. The remains have been identified as JR's, but the cause and manner of death have not yet been released. His body was located not far from where his car had been found when he went missing. Oak Cliff Drive, the area where his body was found, is an offshoot of Cincinnati Avenue in a wooded area north of 66th Street North. Detectives are relieved to finally be able to return Gerald to his family and will continue the investigation to try and determine what led to his untimely death. Susan Marie Nagersmith was born December 30th, 1969 to parents Marilyn and Kent Nagersmith of Carmel, New York. A cheerleader and competitive skier, she was known for her friendly and outgoing personality and as someone with lots of friends who enjoyed having fun. In 1990, at the age of 20, she had just finished her sophomore year at Westchester Community College, where she was majoring in marketing and made plans to go with 5 close friends to celebrate Memorial Day weekend in the shore town of Wildwood, New Jersey. The girls arrived in Wildwood around 1:30 a.m. on Saturday and rented a room at the Sonata Motel. They had some alcohol and marijuana, and Susan decided to leave the room about 9 p.m. and venture out by herself to see if anything exciting was going on in the area. Since Susan was only 20, she couldn't legally drink at any of the bars that line the streets of Wildwood. Those streets were filled with thousands of young adults who had come to the shore for the holiday weekend, and there were dozens of house parties in the area as well. With many of them spilling over into the streets, it didn't take long for Susan to find one that looked inviting, and she began partying with strangers. At some point during the evening, Susan ended up at a party at the JoJo Apartments on Maple Avenue, about 5 blocks away from the motel where she was staying. By the time she got there, she had already consumed a lot of alcohol and was clearly intoxicated. She was seen throwing up at least once, and witnesses recalled that she was having trouble standing. She was offered a ride back to her motel by at least one person who was concerned about her, but she declined. The next morning, May 27, 1990, her partially clothed body was found near dumpsters behind Schellingers, a restaurant located just 2 blocks from one of the busiest sections of the boardwalk where she was seen hours earlier. There was a bloody handprint on her chest and blood on her t-shirt, which along with her bra was pushed up around her neck. There was also blood found on other parts of her body, and she reportedly had a skull fracture. Her jeans were pulled down and twisted around her left ankle, and her tennis shoes were missing and her feet were clean, showing she hadn't walked without her shoes on. A witness would eventually come forward with information. This witness was a 20-year-old man who was visiting the shore from Philadelphia that had left the apartments around 2 a.m. with her. He later told police that he had attempted to escort her back to her hotel, but she was so drunk that she couldn't recall the name of her hotel or where it was located. The man, who admitted that he had been drinking heavily as well, stated that he eventually gave up on Susan and went back to his own room. It was about 2:30 a.m. when he last saw her leaning against the wall of Schellinger's restaurant on Atlantic Avenue at the time. He said she was so intoxicated that she would have been incapable of consenting to sex. A toxicology report showed her blood alcohol content was 0.285. While this witness was one of the last people to see her alive, he was ultimately ruled out as a suspect. Detectives eventually managed to locate and interview a total of 107 people who had seen or spoken to Susan on the night in question. They administered polygraph examinations to 17 people, but all of them were eventually cleared of any involvement in Susan's death. Initially, her death was covered up and classified as accidental due to alcohol intoxication and exposure. It's said that it was ruled accidental because the town wanted to protect terrorism, and it's also said that the medical examiner, Dr. John Napoleon, was incompetent and unqualified for the job. They told the public that she was drunk and she had consensual sex behind the restaurant. And afterwards, she was too drunk to get up, and she froze to death in 57-degree weather. Dr. Napoleon's conclusion was that Susan's cause of death was lethal cardiac arrhythmia and hypothermia due to alcoholic intoxication and exposure. However, he explained away all the bruises on her body by claiming she had likely injured herself by falling down due to her level of intoxication. This lit a fire under her angry parents and local residents as well. Police could no longer conduct a homicide investigation despite the fact that many of them believed Susan had been murdered. A Seattle City resident named Terry Downey joined Susan's parents to attest to accidental ruling. She's also made a name for herself in Cape May County by questioning investigations into the deaths of several other women that occurred in recent years. Susan's parents hired attorneys and private investigators and fought a legal battle. Susan's father, Mr. Negersmith, also sought a second and third opinion from forensic pathologists who both reached the same conclusion. Susan was a homicide victim. The fight for justice had continued for 3 long years when a new prosecutor, Steve Moore, became the new Cape May County District Attorney. After reading the Negersmith's file, Moore reached the same conclusion as Susan's family. He lobbied state law enforcement officials, and an extensive review by the state police led them to the same finding: homicide. After a 3-year battle, her cause of death was changed to homicide after a world-renowned forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, viewed autopsy photos and listed 26 points of trauma on Susan's body. But still, the original medical examiner refused to change her death certificate. It wasn't until 1995 when a new coroner, Dr. Elliot Gross, was appointed coroner and agreed to take another look at Susan's death. Dr. Gross examined Susan's larynx, which had been preserved, and found that it had fractures consistent with manual strangulation. In October 1995, the cause of death on Susan's death certificate was finally changed to homicide. An autopsy determined that she was sexually assaulted before her death, and DNA from the assault was preserved. A profile was later created from the DNA, and in 2018, the Major Crimes Unit started a genetic genealogy analysis of the unknown DNA profile. Using genetic genealogy, genealogists and investigators were able to narrow it down to 62-year-old Jerry Rosado. Rosado then provided a buccal swab on May 26, 2021, exactly 31 years after the attack, to officially verify the match. He was later arrested 32 years after the murder, but has only been charged with second-degree crime of sexual assault. No murder charges have been filed in the case, but authorities say further charges could be made should additional information become available. He now faces 5 to 10 years if convicted of the sexual assault. 22-year-old Christine McWhorter and her aunt, 31-year-old Beatrice Daniels, were originally from the Philadelphia area of Pennsylvania and moved to Mount Union, Pennsylvania, to get away from the city violence. The women lived in the Chestnut Terrace housing complex with Christine's 4-month-old daughter and 4-year-old son in Mount Union. Neighbors would report that on January 3, 2009, they heard yelling and commotion in the early morning hours. Later that same morning, Christine's 4-year-old son was able to finally get a neighbor's attention. That's when it was discovered that both women were found lying in their bed, shot to death. It's unknown how long the children were left alone with the bodies, but it's believed the murders occurred sometime between 9 p.m. on January 2nd and noon on January 3rd, which is when the 4-year-old got the attention of a neighbor. Droplets of blood were taken into evidence from the scene, and the initial DNA report concluded that the blood collected from the stairs and interior doors of the apartment were all deposited by an unidentified male. 7 years later, on March 14, 2016, Trooper David Clemens submitted DNA samples to DNA Solutions, which in turn prepared and forwarded the samples to Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon performed phenotyping on a blood sample which narrowed the suspect down to a medium to light-skinned African-American male with green or hazel eyes and little to no freckles. On July 12, 2018, Parabon conducted a genetic genealogy analysis of the DNA recovered from the murder scene. 3 months later, they provided a report on the genetic genealogy of the DNA and identified Mariko Tyrone Johnson as a potential match. Johnson was interviewed over a year later at his home in Newport News, Virginia. He told investigators that he knew Christine through his then-girlfriend, Cynthia Swan, whom he dated from 2001 until 2012. The women were close friends, but Johnson denied having ever entered Christine's apartment. He provided his DNA to detectives, which was sent off to the state police lab in December 2019. The lab reported Johnson's DNA matched the blood evidence found on the stairs and interior doors of the crime scene. Investigators then compared Johnson's time card to the estimated time of the double murder. The complaint says that on January 22, 2020, state police received time cards from Johnson's then-employer, the New York Department of Corrections, which confirmed he was off of work on January 2, 2009, and started his January 3rd shift at 7 a.m. Police estimate the time it takes to travel the 294 miles between Mount Union and Johnson's then workplace is 4 hours and 43 minutes. Police checked to see if Johnson had access to a .25 caliber firearm, the type used to kill Christine and Beatrice. His half-brother told troopers that he thought his late father owned a .25 caliber handgun and that Johnson inherited their father's belongings when he passed away in 1998. Johnson was then arrested on May 24, 2022 and charged with 2 counts of criminal homicide 13 years after the double murder. Investigators interviewed Johnson's ex-girlfriend, Cynthia, and learned that she was originally supposed to travel with Christine from Philadelphia to Mount Union on January 1, 2009 and stay for the weekend, but decided at the last minute to remain in Philadelphia with a man, Benjamin June. Cynthia told the troopers it was around this time that Johnson found out that Cynthia was having an affair with June. Police say the last incoming text on Christine's cell phone was from Cynthia, asking Christine to call her, and it was important, but she never responded to the text. Johnson remains behind bars with an upcoming trial, but has spent the last 13 years enjoying his freedom. Kara Nancy Nichols was born on May 20, 1993 to parents Julia and Paul Nichols. She grew up in Colorado Springs, Colorado with an older brother and a younger sister. During her sophomore year of high school, Kara fell into depression when her family dog died. Her parents tried to get her to go to counseling, but Kara refused and didn't take her prescribed medication. Instead, Kara started using drugs and became rebellious and manic and was most likely struggling with an untreated mental illness. She attended Rampart High School in Colorado Springs and later graduated from local alternative high school Life Skills of Colorado Springs, where she could work at her own pace. After graduation, Kara began waitressing and modeling part-time, mostly lingerie shoes. She also created a profile on Model Mayhem, an online modeling website that links models with photographers. In the summer of 2012, Kara quit her job and moved with her family to Chicago, Illinois. Her drug abuse worsened and her family enrolled her in a drug treatment program, but she was discharged early when she didn't follow the rules. In August of 2012, Kara moved back to Colorado Springs on her own. She lived in a home with 3 male roommates in the 6700 block of Mission Road in the Cimarron Hills area of Colorado Springs. A couple months later, on October 9, 2012, she told her roommate that she would be traveling from Colorado Springs to Denver for a photo shoot job. When she left, she was picked up by someone in a dark sedan. Her brother Terrence last spoke to her at almost midnight that night, and she said she was on her way to Denver for a modeling assignment. 2 days later, Kara's parents reported her missing when she didn't return. On November 30, 2012, a profile featuring photos of Kara appeared on My Red Book, which is an online Las Vegas escort website. When police called the number, her family said the voice was not hers. Authorities eventually concluded that the photos were taken from another source and that Kara was not in Las Vegas. And escort websites often use random pictures lifted from the internet to advertise online. Months later, police learned she had actually been working as an escort and had placed an ad wearing lingerie on a classified ad website at 7:28 p.m. the night she disappeared. Kara's cell phone records revealed she made 8 calls on October 9, 2012 between 9:58 p.m. and 11:08 p.m. and that she last used her phone at 11:59 p.m. On May 8, 2013, the detective finally received a return call from a man who identified himself as Joel Hollendorfer. When asked if the phone belonged to Hollendorfer, he said yes. The detective said he was investigating a missing person case and his number was on the list of records from the night she disappeared. Hollendorfer said he was seeking escort services that night and answered Kara's ad, saying they spoke several times that night, but he was looking to go to her, but she only went to locations. Hollendorfer went on to say that they never met that night. Investigations volunteer Mark Oldfield was able to track Kara's phone movements the night of October 9th to its last known usage in the early hours of October 10, 2012. Mark was able to determine that Kara left her house at approximately 11:16 p.m. and traveled the route that led directly toward Burgess Road, where Hollendorfer's family owned a farm. Further details revealed 6 calls and texts were sent and received from 11:34 p.m. to 11:41 p.m. coming off Woodsman Tower. Based on Kara's phone activity, her phone was at the intersection of Woodman and Black Forest Road at 11:33 p.m. Based on the last known activity from Kira's phone, it led them to 9665 Burgess Road. Detective Gigliotta obtained a search warrant for the address on October 2, 2014, a year after she went missing. Multiple agencies participated in the search, including cadaver dogs. Hollendorfer's mother, Betty, walked the property with members from the search team and pointed out numerous locations where animals may be buried since purchasing the property in 1985. Cadaver dogs were brought to the property and ground-penetrating radar was used to determine spots that had been disturbed. But instead of excavating the spots, they did what Betty suggested. They searched the property across the street at 11,660 Greenacres Lane, which her son also had access to. Cadaver dogs narrowed in on a shallow grave which was excavated, and it was apparent that roots were dug up at the site and a hole had been dug to about the size of a human body, but no human remains were found. For reasons that are not explained in the affidavit, none of the other areas the dogs hid on were excavated, leading to the question, why bring cadaver dogs to a property and not dig when they hid on certain areas? Turns out, Betty was protecting her son, and if they would have excavated the areas across the street that the dogs hid on, they would have found what they were looking for. During an interview that same month, Hollendorfer admitted to looking up Kara online, wanting to meet her and communicating with her. He said Kara never met him at the location that she was supposed to, and he never ended up meeting her. He added that he had been heavily involved with escorts and drugs, which he says is why his marriage ended. During the initial investigation, Detective Gigliotta attempted to reach Hollendorfer's wife, Christina, but she wouldn't cooperate with the initial investigation and never made a statement. However, on February 1, 2022, 10 years after Kara's disappearance, FBI special agents interviewed Christina. Turns out, she had been keeping a huge secret for 8 years, until investigators tracked her down to Virginia and knocked on her door. Now known as Christina Palmer, she stated that after Hollendorfer's father died in November 2014, he admitted to her that he accidentally killed an escort he hired and buried her body on top of an old horse grave on his parents during the interview. Christina stated that Hollendorfer said that he accidentally strangled Kara to death and then buried her on an old horse grave with plastic bags and lime. She also told detectives that Hollendorfer said he told his parents what he did and that he believed it had driven his father to his grave. Based on the information she provided, on February 7, 2022, a search warrant was obtained and a team of El Paso County Sheriff's Office detectives and specialists, alongside the FBI Evidence Response Team, were deployed to the 9600 block of Burgess Road. Police zeroed in on a spot where his mother said her favorite horse Milo was buried. 3 feet down, they found a garbage bag, a human hand, and more remains. Hollendorfer was then arrested days later on charges of second-degree murder and tampering with physical evidence, ending a 10-year mystery that could have ended 9 years earlier. During a court appearance on February 17, 2022, Hollendorfer's charge was upgraded from second to first-degree murder, and his bond was revoked based on the autopsy results. Kara's family has long maintained that the El Paso County Sheriff's Department botched the initial investigation and the sheriff, Terry McKetta, was run out of office amid allegations of misconduct in 2014. Some describe McKetta's term in Colorado Springs as similar to living in the Wild West. Many describe former Sheriff McKetta as very corrupt. He allegedly led an incredibly corrupt department and was involved with multiple women in the department, giving them lavish raises and spending department funds on romantic vacations with them. He would also allegedly punish or fire the women who wouldn't sleep with him. He also allegedly had a hit list of people he intended to kill. At the same time, one officer was running an extensive Ponzi scheme in the department. David Hawkins had collected around $300,000 in cash from fellow deputies and even their families, but never invested it and was eventually convicted and sent to prison. The allegations against Makeda were already years old at that point, but he couldn't be forced to resign because of some technicality. Makeda also mismanaged the investigation into the devastating Black Forest fire. In the summer of 2021, less than a year before Kara's body was discovered, several local area residents became concerned about the condition of two horses on the Hollendorfers' property, Meadowview Farm. The El Paso County Sheriff's Office investigated and had a veterinarian and a horse rescue come to the site. Unfortunately, both horses had to be euthanized because they were so starved they could not be saved. It's unclear what, if any, charges were filed against the Hollendorfers. I'm sure they were likely more concerned about law enforcement being so close to Kara's grave at the time. Her parents were in disbelief 2 years after their daughter went missing over a recording released by the El Paso County Sheriff's Office that suggests the initial investigator brushed off the case. In the 50-minute recording, Patrol Deputy Cliff Porter is confronted by his superiors about statements he made in Kara's case. Porter was taken off the case after a couple of months, but he came under fire after statements he made to his replacement were reported to his superiors. He repeated those statements in a meeting as well. This is what he said. I said, maybe somebody would finally just say, look, this is a cold case. This girl is probably dead. We're going to work the leads, but we're going to shelve this thing. We won't overreact every time Mr. Nichols comes in. Kira's mother stated that in the first few weeks, they were wondering why Officer Porter wouldn't respond to their calls. And when he did, he seemed very cynical, very negative about the possibility of finding their daughter alive. She stated, "You just wonder what else has gone on. You wonder how many other victims have been treated like this. It just re-victimized a family who's already suffering." 34-year-old Rita Gutierrez Garcia was born April 7, 1983, and was described as an attentive and compassionate mother of her 3 boys. On March 17, 2018, she went out with friends to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. After spending time at the Speakeasy and Breakers Grill on Main Street in Longmont, Colorado, she and friends went through the alleyway to the parking lot behind Three's Bar to leave. Rita was on the phone with someone at 2:30 a.m. when she told her friends she was getting a ride with someone else, and so they left. Sadly, this is the last time they would see her alive. Later, her mom arrived at Rita's home on Sunday to take her 18, 13, and 9-year-old grandsons to church. That's when the grandmother learned her daughter was missing, and after an exhaustive search for her, they reported her missing the following day. Early on in the investigation, Juan Figueroa was identified as a possible suspect in her disappearance. Several witnesses also reported that he had interacted with Rita inside the bar about 1:30 a.m. and was seen outside of the bar near her about an hour later. A security camera captured Figueroa's truck traveling through that exact same area at 3:03 a.m. Cell phone data from Rita's phone placed her phone near the 600 block between Main Street and Kaufman Street between 2:40 a.m. to 03:03 a.m. on the morning she was last seen. 4 minutes later, 2 911 call hang-ups were made from Rita's phone. Her phone dropped off the network at 3:10 a.m. and was in the area of 3rd Avenue and Vivian Street in Longmont at that time. Rita was missing, and evidence pointed to one person responsible for her disappearance. That was Figueroa. Figueroa left Colorado 2 days after Rita went missing after police attempted to contact him at his mother's home in regards to her disappearance. He was briefly in Texas, but later crossed the border into Mexico. While in Mexico, he asked several people for money and said he was in trouble and that he planned to sell his truck. He tried to re-enter the U.S. and was arrested on March 27, 2018 on a warrant for a separate sexual assault and attempted murder of a woman a year earlier, for which he was later convicted and sentenced to 93 years to life. While behind bars, he told a cellmate that he strangled the missing woman and disposed of her body before returning to his sister's house. He also told that cellmate, according to the indictment, that she had called him a weirdo, which caused him to punch her, knocking her unconscious. After that, he strangled her to death. Prosecutors presented their case to a grand jury in April 2021 as a no-body homicide as DNA evidence and cell phone data linked him to her presumed murder. 2 months later, the grand jury indicted him for first-degree murder and kidnapping in Rita's case. In court, he admitted to knocking her unconscious, dragging her to his vehicle, and strangling her. He said he believed he was insane that night and snapped when she called him a weirdo. As part of a plea deal, Figueroa led investigators to the location of Rita's body. She was recovered in an area of northern Colorado's Weld County on April 28, 2022. Figueroa pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping. He was immediately sentenced to 48 years in prison. The sentences will be served concurrently along with the 93-year sentence he's already serving for the unrelated case of kidnapping and attempted murder of another victim. Clifford Bernhard served his country as an Army sergeant in the Vietnam War and was ultimately awarded a Purple Heart. After serving in the Army, he began working as a construction worker. On June 7, 1969, he would marry his high school sweetheart, Linda Reich. The couple was very much in love and very well liked by all that knew them. On November 6, 1973, the 24-year-olds were still settling into their new ranch-style home at 1116 Dorothy Lane near the Yellowstone River in Billings, Montana. They had planned to go have dinner at Linda's parents' house around the corner, but they decided to cancel. Linda called her mother June Reich and told her they planned on staying in for the night instead. The two enjoyed a hamburger casserole that Linda had whipped up for them. The next morning, when Linda didn't show up for work, her mother went to check on the couple and came upon a horrifying scene. She found the couple tragically and brutally murdered. Cliff was found lying face down in the master bedroom with a severe wound to his head. Cliff and Linda had both been strangled to death, and Linda had been sexually assaulted and left naked on the floor of another bedroom. There were also signs that both were bound at the wrist and ankles at some point. Strangely, and possibly from the shock of it all, while waiting for law enforcement to arrive, Linda's mother cleaned up the dishes which disturbed the crime scene. She stated that it appeared to her that before doing the dishes that the table may have been set for 3 people. The killer had opened up windows in both bedrooms the bodies were found in and turned the furnace down all the way. The lowest temperature that night was 6 degrees, making it cold enough for a bowl of ice cubes found next to Linda's body to remain frozen. It's unknown what the bowl of ice next to her body was for, but possibly used during the sexual assault. Missing from the house was all of Linda's panties, some of her shoes, and her green suitcase. With no signs of forced entry, investigators speculated that they knew their killer and had willingly let them in. Also, the murder may have been premeditated as he brought his own leather bindings. The crime devastated the Bernhard and Reich families and left a void in the lives of all who knew Linda and Clifford. Over many years, about 80 DNA samples were collected from persons of interest, but none were a match. In 2004, there was a huge break in the case when DNA was discovered on Linda's purple pants. It was entered into Cody's, but there was no matches. Then in 2012, a cold case unit became obsessed with finding the killer in the following year. An anonymous donor offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to a conviction. In 2015, the county hired Parabon to analyze the DNA and created a composite predicting the suspect's ethnicity, hair, and eye color and complexion. A few years later, in 2018, when forensic genetic genealogy was fully blossoming, genealogists were working tirelessly to pinpoint who the DNA belonged to. Finally, on January 3, 2019, Parabon determined the suspect was one of 2 brothers. Unfortunately, one of those brothers had died, and so investigators obtained DNA from the one living and were able to rule him out, which means the DNA could only belong to one individual. 45 years after Linda and Cliff's deaths, authorities announced the suspect, Cecil Stan Caldwell, a former co-worker of Linda's at a grocery store warehouse. Linda worked in billing and secretarial work while Caldwell worked in the warehouse and meat department. He was also a father of 2 adopted children and 2 stepchildren and had no criminal history. Unfortunately, in 2003, he died in Billings at the age of 59 and never faced justice. Caldwell had no arrest record, and authorities likely will never know the true motive for the slayings. Former Deputy Dean Mellum, who worked on the case in 1973, said he hopes the news will at least give some comfort to the couple's families. In 1982, 29-year-old Barbara Jo Oberholzer, who went by the nickname Bobby Joe, lived near the small ski town of Breckenridge, Colorado. She was an avid animal lover, very soft-spoken, and had moved from Wisconsin to Colorado because of her love for the mountains and animals in the state. Bobby Joe worked as a receptionist, and on January 6, 1982, she received a pay raise and went to celebrate with friends that evening at the village pub in Breckenridge. When she called her husband, Jeff, after 6 p.m. to let him know, he asked her if she wanted him to pick her up, but she said she already had a ride and would be home shortly. He then made dinner and waited for her to come home. It was common in 1982 to hitchhike around the Breckenridge area, something Bobby Joe did frequently. On this particular day, she had left home at 7:15 a.m., hitchhiked to work, and worked all day. So after a few drinks with friends, she was tired and ready to make the 16-mile trip home to Alma, where her husband Jeff and 11-year-old daughter were. But her friends were not ready to leave. So around 7:30 p.m. she told them she was going to hitchhike home and went to the nearby designated common area known for hitchhikers to wait for rides. Meanwhile, that same evening, 21-year-old Annette Schnee had a short break between her two jobs at the Holiday Inn in Frisco, where she cleaned rooms during the day, and at night, she worked as a waitress at the Flipside Bar in Breckenridge. After high school, Annette spent a year at a modeling school in Nebraska known as Patricia Stevens College. She then decided that she wanted to become an airline attendant and was working her way to that dream. She was scheduled to be at work at 8 p.m. at the Flipside Bar and was seen about 5 p.m. leaving a pharmacy in Breckenridge, and she had stopped to talk to an unidentified woman. It's speculated that she likely planned to hitchhike home, which was only 4 miles away in Blue River. That night, Bobby Joe would not arrive home to her husband and daughter, and Annette would not arrive for her shift at 8 p.m. Although it's not believed that the two women were acquaintances, they both worked in Breckenridge, and like many people in the 80s and in the area, they often hitchhiked, which they likely did this evening, but unknowingly got in the killer's vehicle and met their demise. The next day, Bobby Joe's driver's license was found by a rancher who called and notified Jeff. Soon after, Jeff and a friend began driving in that direction, when they noticed a backpack in the distance off the road. Hours later, her body was found off US 285 in the snow on the summit of Hoosier Pass. She had been fatally shot, and one wrist contained a pair of zip ties, and it was determined that she had bled out and froze to death. Found nearby was a single orange sock and her keychain with a hook made for her by Jeff so it could be used as a self-defense weapon. This was strange because Bobby Joe was wearing both her socks. Jeff had found her backpack about 20 miles from the crime scene on US 285. Found inside was Bobby Joe's bloody glove and tissue that also contained blood. It was evident from the footprints in the fresh snow that she had likely broken free from her killer and was chased down and shot at close range. Her husband, Jeff, was the first person of interest in the case, not only because it was standard procedure, but because many found it strange that he was the person that located some of her belongings and touched and contaminated them. Soon after, it was learned that Annette had also gone missing the night before, same as Bobby Joe. About 6 months later, on July 3, 1983, a man and his 9-year-old son were fishing at Sacramento Creek when the boy found a fully clothed woman's body partially submerged. She had been fatally shot as well, but investigators could not locate a bullet. During the autopsy, something strange stuck out to the CBI agent attending the procedure. An orange sock on her left foot appeared to match the one found near Bobby Joe's body months earlier. A long striped sock was on her right foot, and the matching sock was found in the pocket of her sweatshirt. Annette's mother told the police that the orange socks belonged to her daughter. It speculated that Annette was killed first and one of her socks was left behind. Then, when Bobby Joe was murdered hours later and dumped, the killer threw the matching sock out with her stuff. The investigators believed that the cases were obviously related. They desperately wanted to speak to the unidentified woman whom Annette was seen talking to outside the pharmacy right before she went missing, but she could never be located. Also, the location where Annette's body was discarded was in an area that likely only locals would know about. Therefore, they pulled a list of all local registered sex offenders and began attempting to rule them out one by one. A couple of months later, Annette's backpack was found along Highway 9, Strangely, inside was a business card from Jeff's repair business, along with a picture of an unknown man. The focus then centered on Bobby Joe's husband, Jeff, who was home in Alma the night his wife and Annette went missing, an alibi later verified. He stated that the reason she had his business card was that he had given her a ride in the past while she was hitchhiking. Years later, the blood found on Bobby Joe's glove and the bloody tissue was tested, and although it did belong to a man, it did not belong to her husband. After 2 lie detector tests that Jeff had taken and passed, along with his alibi and DNA test, it was finally determined that he was not their killer and the business card was merely a coincidence. After a DNA profile was created, many of the suspects in the case were ruled out. The DNA was entered into Cody's, but no matches were found. Meanwhile, one man remained at the top of their suspect list, Tom Luther. About 6 weeks after Bobby Joe and Annette disappeared, Luther was arrested for a brutal physical and sexual attack on a woman he offered a ride to while claiming to be a cab driver in Summit County. Luther went to prison for the attack and was released, and then arrested again following the 1993 murder of 20-year-old Cher Elder, who was last seen leaving a casino in Central City, Colorado. Years later, investigators learned that while he was behind bars in 1982, before Annette's body was discovered, he told other inmates that he had killed 2 young women near Breckenridge and that the authorities would never find the second girl's body. The 2 lead investigators, PI Charlie McCormick and Officer Richard Eaton, verified the inmates' claims. They then flew to West Virginia, where Luther was serving prison time for a separate rape case, to question him. He angrily denied any involvement in the women's deaths. He then remarked, "They aren't my girls," and reminded the investigators that his weapon of choice was a hammer, not a gun, and they were looking at the wrong man. Also, once his DNA was tested, it did not match the male DNA from Bobby Joe's glove. Beginning in 1999, a task force of 5 people came together to try to solve the murders and began meeting yearly to discuss updates. Then finally, when forensic genetic genealogy exploded, the DNA profile was used to track down a likely suspect. A genealogist created a family tree of over 12,000 people and narrowed it down to possible offenders in the area around the time of the murders. Finally, one name was given to investigators who then surveilled the man for weeks, hoping to get a DNA sample. They were successful and it was a match. On February 24, 2021, 38 years after the murders, Alan Lee Phillips was arrested for the murders of Bobby Joe Oberholzer and Annette Schnee and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, assault, and kidnappings. He was a father of 3 and had worked as a mechanic and at the time of his arrest was living west of Denver in Clear Creek County. Interestingly, the night he committed the double murders, his truck became stuck in a snowdrift on a mountain pass and he was helped after signaling SOS with his headlights. A passenger in a plane overhead rescued him and questioned why he had taken such a dangerous road in the freezing temperatures. He said he was coming back from a bar and was even interviewed about the incident in a local newspaper. Many believe that although Phillips has no criminal record, he was likely involved in other slayings because it's hard to believe he killed 2 women hours apart and didn't harm anyone else for the next 4 decades. Annette's 88-year-old mother and Bobby Joe's husband were relieved to witness an arrest in their loved ones' deaths. Cynthia Renee Rogers was described by her mother, Rosia Rogers, as very petite, a free spirit, and loved watching birds and taking long walks. At 27, she was a biologist researching Parkinson's disease at the National Institutes of Health on the St. Elizabeth's Hospital campus in Washington, D.C. Cynthia, who was from D.C., was living in Forestville, Maryland at 6401 Pennsylvania Avenue, number 204. On Super Bowl Sunday, January 22, 1989, Cynthia headed to the local market to purchase some items to make soup. On her way there, she decided to take a shortcut and was viciously attacked and murdered. It would be 5 days before her body was discovered. On January 27, 1989, she was found in the 6,000 block of Surrey Square Lane Service Road in Forestville. She was left on a dirt path littered with trash in an area that locals frequently used as a shortcut to the store less than a mile from her home. She had been beaten and raped before being strangled to death. Sadly, the case would go cold for the next 33 years. A small amount of DNA was collected from her body and preserved. That DNA was used years later in 2018 to exclude several suspects. However, there wasn't a strong enough sample to submit to CODIS. Then in 2020, Prince George County won a grant for almost $500,000. The money would be used for costly DNA tests in hopes of solving cases dating back to 1979, and the county has an abundance of unsolved cases with DNA on file waiting to be tested. In early 2022, Cynthia's case was chosen for additional testing. A lab was able to produce a complete, unidentified male profile. A search of the state of Maryland DNA database resulted in a positive match to 64-year-old James Clinton Cole. According to reports, Cole would have been 32 years old at the time of Cynthia's murder, and there is no reason to believe the two knew each other. Cole was then charged with first-degree murder, first-degree rape, and several additional charges. He had a criminal record and was already in prison when he was identified as her killer. Cole is currently in prison for forcing a 12-year-old girl at knife point into the woods behind Stoddard Middle School in Maryland in 1996. He then sexually assaulted her and left her tied to a tree. Thankfully, she was able to escape, but it changed her life forever. It would take 14 long years before DNA could identify Cole in that case. He was then charged and sentenced to 2 life sentences. He will likely perish behind bars where he remains in Cumberland, Maryland. Thankfully, his victim's family can now have closure. You just forget the war for a moment and come with us to South Australia. On December 1st, 1948, locals saw what they assumed was a man sleeping off a night of too much drinking on Somerton Park Beach, a seaside suburb of Adelaide, Australia. He was found lying on his back in the sand across from the crippled children's home on the corner of the Esplanade and Bickford Terrace. He was dressed in a perfectly pressed, double-breasted suit and tie. His shoes were freshly shined, and his head rested propped up on the seawall. His feet were crossed and he had a cigarette on his collar. Later that morning, the same witnesses noticed that the man had not moved. So a man named John Lyons took a closer look and discovered he was deceased. The post-mortem exam showed signs of some type of poisoning. His spleen was enlarged, his liver was swollen with blood, and blood was found in his stomach. In other words, he was bleeding internally. But there were no signs of injury on the outside of the body. He had last eaten a pasty a few hours before his death that could have been poisoned. However, many tests were done to prove this theory, but no trace of any non-poisons was detected. Police made a plaster cast bust of the John Doe in hopes of future identification. Blood pooling to the back of his head proved that it had been in that position for many hours after his death, possibly since 2 a.m. the morning of his discovery. According to the pathologist John Burton Cleland, the man was of British appearance and thought to be aged between 40 and 45 years old. Also, he was found to be in top physical condition. Found inside his pockets was an unused second-class rail ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach. There was also a bus ticket from the city that may not have been used, a comb that had been manufactured in the USA, a pack of juicy fruit chewing gum, an Army Club cigarette packet that contained 7 cigarettes of different brands, and a quarter-full box of Bryant and May matches. All labels on his clothes had been removed and he had no wallet or hat, which was unusual for 1948. He was clean-shaven, and police initially believed that he had committed suicide. In an attempt to identify the person, investigators checked for dental records, but a match could not be found and he became known as the Somerton Man, or the Unknown Man. Witnesses said the night before they had seen an individual resembling the dead man lying on his back in the same spot where the corpse was later found. A couple who saw him at around 7 p.m. noted that they saw him extend his right arm to its fullest extent and then drop it limply. Another couple who saw him from 7:30 p.m. to 8 p.m., during which time the streetlights had come on, recounted that they did not see him move during the half an hour in which he was in view. However, they did acknowledge that it was odd he was not reacting to the mosquitoes, but nevertheless, they thought he was more than likely drunk or asleep, so they went about their way. Another witness came forward in 1959 and reported to the police that he had seen a well-dressed man carrying another man on his shoulders along Somerton Park Beach the night before the body was found. On the same day of the discovery, the advisor reported the discovery of the body, giving his identification as possibly being E.C. Johnson of Arthur Street, Paynham. The next day, Johnson arrived at the police station and cleared up the misidentification. By early February 1949, there had been 8 different positive identifications of the body, which were all later proven false. For months after his discovery, a piece of paper was found tucked into a fog pocket of his trousers. It was a small piece of paper torn from the final page of a copy of the poem titled, authored by 11th and 12th century Persian poet Omar Khayyam and translated in 1859 by Edward Fitzgerald, a popular book at the time. The torn paper contained the Persian phrase, "Tamam should," meaning is over or is finished. This led to the mysterious case being known as the Tamam Shud case. Months later, the book from which the page had been torn was located. A doctor came forward and said it had been thrown into his car parked near the same beach where the man had been found. He said he often left the windows of his car open and thought little of it until he read about the search for the book in the paper. To add to the mystery, on the inside back cover was a local telephone number, another unidentified number, and text that resembled a coded message that still hasn't officially been decoded. The phone number X3239 turned out to be that of a nurse in training named Jessica Ellen Thompson. She lived at 90A Glenelg Street, just 200 yards from where he was discovered. Also, she reportedly worked at the home for crippled children located in front of where the body was found. Much of the case would become centered around Jessica Thompson. When interviewed, she denied knowing the man and was very evasive. When shown the cast of his face by police, she appeared shocked and looked away and wouldn't look back. She stated that she had given a copy of the Rubaiyat to Alfred Boxall, an Australian Army lieutenant who she had met at the Clifton Gardens Hotel in Sydney in 1944. She reportedly gave him the copy over drinks at the hotel prior to him going overseas to serve in World War II. Boxall was tracked down the next day and was very much alive, and his copy of the book of poetry was intact. While being questioned, she requested that her real name be withheld because she didn't want her husband to know she knew Alf Boxall. But it turns out that she was not yet married to Prosper Thompson. She and Thompson didn't marry until May 1950, a year and a half later, because he had to wait for his divorce from his wife Queenie to be final. Jessica had given birth to a son named Robin Thompson out of wedlock in July 1947. She gave him the surname Thompson because she was unmarried and because of the stigma of an unmarried woman having a child. She had to leave her nurse training at the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney due to the pregnancy. It became suspected that Robin was the biological son of either the Somerton man or Alfred Boxall and passed off as Prosper Thompson's son. After being tediously analyzed, it was suggested that the code found on the piece of paper in his pocket was more than likely an acrostic rather than a cipher. This is because its letter frequencies differed considerably from letters written down randomly. The format of the code also appeared to follow the quatrain format of the Rubaiyat, supporting the theory that the code was a one-time pad encryption algorithm. This was one of the reasons many were led to believe that he was a Cold War-era spy. Unable to determine his identity, he would go unidentified for the next 74 years. His case has baffled professional and amateur detectives around the world since 1948. 6 weeks after the man's discovery, a suitcase containing his property was retrieved from Adelaide Railway Station's cloakroom. It had been checked in at around 11 a.m. the day before his death and included a dressing gown, slippers, underpants, shaving supplies, pajamas, trousers with sand in the cuffs, and some tools and instruments. You could say the tools could be used for hot wiring vehicles and breaking and entering, but no evidence points to him being a criminal. However, apart from 3 items marked Keen, and T. Keen, nothing indicating the man's identity was found in those belongings. Also, nobody with that name was reported missing. There was also a Barber brand thread card that wasn't available in Australia. It was orange and had been used to repair the lining in his trousers pocket. Forensic VR specialist Daniel Voshart created his visual representation of the Somerton man. The man's fingerprints and photographs were sent worldwide, and a letter signed by FBI Director John Edgar Hoover confirmed the U.S. had found no match for his fingerprints in its files. Jessica Thompson, the nurse questioned by police regarding the Rubaiyat she had given away, later died in 2007. However, 6 years later, her daughter, Kate Thompson, was interviewed for the Australian 60 Minutes Current Affairs TV program. Kate revealed that her mother had a dark side. Kate said her mother had told her that she indeed did know more about the Somerton man, but had deliberately not revealed it to the police. Jessica told her it was a mystery that was only known to a level higher than the police force. She also revealed that her mother could speak Russian, which suggested that she may have been involved in some spy-related activity. She also taught English to migrants and was interested in communism. Kate said she always wondered if her mother was responsible for the man's death. It was also of note that the copy of the book Jessica had given away had been signed with the name Justin. Her daughter, Kate, said that some of her nursing pals, all those decades earlier, called her Tina. A card sent to her in her later years from her nursing pals said, "Dear Tina, Tina," or "Dear Tina, Tina." Her mother explained this as just "together with Tina and you have Justin." On May 19, 2021, after years of denied requests to do so, the body was exhumed for DNA collection. A hair trapped in his death mask made of plaster was used to create a DNA profile. This profile was used for genetic genealogy research performed by Australian researcher and Adelaide University physicist, Professor Derek Abbott, along with renowned American genealogist, Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick. Abbott began investigating the identity of the Somerton man over a decade ago with his conscripted students at the University of Adelaide and using the book written about the case by ex-detective Gary Feltz, the cold case investigator. They built a complex family tree of around 4,000 names that finally led to the man's identity whose date of death had not been recorded. They initially found a first cousin 3 times removed and matched DNA obtained from his hair to DNA tests taken from his distant relatives. Finally, after 74 years, they determined the Somerton man's identity and announced it on July 26, 2022. They determined that the man was Carl Charles Webb, born November 16, 1905, and the youngest of 6. Charles was a 43-year-old electrical engineer and instrument maker from Footscray in Melbourne, Australia. Little is known about his early life, but he married Dorothy Jean Robertson, known as Doff Webb, in October 1941, and abandoned her in April 1947. They had no non-children together. Webb had resided in Victoria and had a brother-in-law, Thomas Keane, who lived about 20 minutes away from him, explaining the name on some of the clothes. But 4 months after applying for a divorce for desertion, she placed an ad for him in Melbourne's Missing Friends section of the Aged newspaper. It was a formal notice to make him aware of divorce proceedings, and if he didn't appear on the scheduled court date, the case might proceed in his absence. She was finally granted a divorce in April 1952. Dove Webb applied for divorce nearly 3 years after his body was found. She said he had suffered several devastating tragedies before disappearing. The documents showed 4 of his close relatives died within 7 years. He lost a brother and nephew in World War II. His father died in 1939 and his mother died in 1946. She stated that he was rude and unpleasant at times, refusing to speak to her, but lived a quiet life being in bed by 7 p.m. each night. She claimed that one night in January 1946, he told her they were not suited for each other and would be better apart. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, an expert with Identifinders International who helped identify the Somerton man, said Mrs. Webb's claims are only half the story. She suspects that Webb had mental health issues and would spiral down. Confirming Webb's name raises many more questions about who he was and how he died. No death record for Webb exists, and his last known records date to April 1947 when he left his wife. She later moved to Butte, South Australia, 89 miles from Adelaide, and he had possibly been trying to track her down. Abbott's research indicates Webb enjoyed betting on horses, thus the coded messages could be horses' names. Webb was also fond of poetry and had written some of his own, explaining the "To Mom Should" poem. Unfortunately, researchers have not been able to locate any photos of Webb before his death. In 2009, Professor Abbott consulted with dental experts who concluded the Somerton man had a very rare genetic disorder of hypodontia affecting his incisor teeth. University of Adelaide professor of anatomy, Masha Kenneberg, assessed photos of his ears and found a feature possessed by only 1 to 2% of the population. A photo of Robin showed he shared both these anomalies. Experts say the ears are telling signs of whether two people are related. The chance of coincidence is estimated at between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in 20,000. In addition, both Robin and Webb shared very muscular calves similar to ballet dancers, which Robin was. In 2009, Professor Abbott tried to find Jessica Thompson, whose phone number had come from the Mystery Man's poetry book. Unfortunately, she died in 2007 and her son Robin died in 2009. Robin turned out to have been a professional ballet dancer whose teeth and ears were said to be remarkably similar to the Somerton man's. However, Abbott eventually found and interviewed that man's daughter, Rachel Egan. He first wrote her a letter about her possible relation to the Somerton man, and then the two met at a fancy restaurant in Brisbane. The two then fell in love and got married the following year in 2010. They are now happily married with 3 children. However, once Rachel's DNA was tested, she was linked to being related to Prosper Thompson, not Carl Webb. She also learned during the process that she was adopted and Robin, who she had never met, was her biological father. Rachel made contact with her biological mother, Roma Egan, and soon moved to Brisbane to be with her. She learned her parents had met when they were both dancers at the Australian Ballet School. Her father, Robin, got a job with the Royal New Zealand Ballet Company and Roma went with him to New Zealand. Roma then became pregnant, but she and Robin didn't have the means to keep her, so they put her up for adoption. Rachel's mother was suspicious of her relationship with Professor Abbott. Not only did it move very quickly, but she feared he was just out for her DNA or maybe just wanted to bear children with her so they could share the same DNA as the Somerton man that had become his sole focus for many years. This caused the newly introduced mother and daughter to become quickly estranged. While the Somerton man has been identified, his cause of death remains a mystery, one that we will likely never know. Crystal Faye Todd was born on January 4, 1974 in Conway, South Carolina to parents Junior and Bonnie Todd. At the age of 17, she was a senior at a Conway, South Carolina high school, and as an early graduation gift, her mother Bonnie Faye Todd had given her a brand new 1991 Toyota Celica. On November 17, 1991, Crystal stopped in for her grandmother's birthday celebration and left about 7 p.m. kissing her mother goodbye and saying she was headed to the mall to meet her friends. Around 9 p.m. Crystal and a friend decided to go to a party in the Punchbowl community where they stayed until 11 p.m. After dropping her friend off at home, Crystal rushed back to the mall to say goodbye to friends before her midnight curfew. But she never arrived home that night, and when midnight came and went, her mother became very concerned. At 3 a.m., Bonnie phoned police and a dispatcher took her description along with the description of her car. He tried to reassure her it wasn't unusual for teens to show up late and that Bonnie should just let him know when her daughter got home. At 8 a.m., Bonnie was panicking and called 911. Next, she contacted her daughter's longtime close friend, Ken Register, who said that he hadn't seen Crystal all night and that he would check the local hospitals. 2 of Crystal's friends had found her car parked at the Conway Middle School. An officer was dispatched to the location and found the car locked with Crystal's purse still inside. The officer tried to reassure her that Crystal was likely still out with friends and having too much fun to call or come home. But Bonnie knew that wasn't like Crystal, and she said she knew her daughter wasn't coming home. The next day, on November 18, 1991, 2 men were driving just outside of Conway in the Maple community when one of them noticed something odd lying in the ditch along the road. Getting out for a closer inspection, the men realized it was a female body. The scene was gruesome and she was found to have been sexually assaulted. Her mother, a widow, was inconsolable. She told police that she was certain that Crystal's killer was someone she knew. Investigators believed the same thing, especially when they learned that she would have never gotten into a vehicle with someone she didn't know. Criminal profilers predicted that the killer would be an angry young white male who was confident the law wouldn't catch him, and he was probably a friend of the victim. Police asked 51 of Crystal's male friends and acquaintances if they would give DNA samples, and they all agreed. Crystal's friends, including longtime friend Ken Register, were there for Bonnie through the entire ordeal. Ken and Crystal had grown up together and remained close friends, and even Bonnie had always been fond of him. He was a shoulder for Bonnie to cry on and someone to rant to. However, before she was murdered, The friendship between Crystal and Ken had taken a turn for the worse. Crystal had confided in Bonnie that Ken had propositioned her for sex, despite the fact that he had a girlfriend and she had been appalled by this. The two had dated briefly in their early teens, but then decided to return to being close friends again. There had also been serious warning signs about Ken in the previous years. When he was 15, he made an obscene phone call to a grown woman and described in sickening detail how he wanted to mutilate and kill her. When it was his turn to be interviewed by police, he hesitantly but willingly provided his DNA, but the lab was backlogged, and it would be a couple months before they got to all the DNA samples collected from the citizens. Then, on February 15, 1992, the lab notified the police that they had a DNA match. Ken Register eventually broke down and confessed to the crime. He told investigators a story that is very likely untrue. He told them on the night Crystal died, they had unprotected consensual sex. Ken said when he didn't use protection, Crystal became furious and threatened to cry rape if she became pregnant. Said he became outraged at Crystal's screaming and insults, and before he realized what he was doing, he was stabbing her. Ken told investigators when he came to his senses and realized what he'd done, he panicked. He pulled Crystal from his car, tossed her into the ditch, threw away the knife and hurried home. Crystal's car keys and other evidence was found located at the Register home. Bonnie was shocked that she had been duped by Ken, who even served as a pallbearer at her daughter's funeral. After Register's arrest, it was discovered he had been arrested in September 1991 for exposing himself to a couple of teenage girls after asking them for directions. The charges were still pending when he was arrested for Crystal's murder. In September 1992, Register was tried on the indecent exposure charges and quickly found guilty. Then in early 1993, jurors found him guilty for Crystal's death, his sexual misconduct, kidnapping, and torture. Ken Register was sentenced to life in prison and remains incarcerated at the Broad River Prison in Columbia, South Carolina. There are reportedly many friends and family members of Crystal's who continue to write to and attend parole hearings anytime he is eligible. Despite being sentenced to 2 life sentences, he was eligible for parole in February 2022, but he waived his right to face the parole board. Nearly 2,700 people signed a petition asking that his parole not be granted. He will be eligible to face the parole board again in 2024. Her mother Bonnie passed away in 2014 and is buried next to her daughter in Conway. The petition to keep this monster behind bars where he belongs is at change.org, and I will put the link in the description. Yanira Cedias was born on March 3, 1992, and by the age of 30, she was a mother of 3 young children and described as vibrant and lively with a big smile. On March 4, 2022, Yanira was celebrating her 30th birthday at a local casino. After the celebration, her ex-boyfriend, Juan Gastelum, picked her up and took her back to his apartment. This was the last time she was ever seen alive. After going missing, Moses Lake police called Yanira's phone to see if someone would answer. A man believed to be her ex, Gastelum, answered the phone. This information led police to question Gastelum. Allegedly, after they arrived at his apartment, Gastelum murdered Yanira and then took photos of himself sexually assaulting her. He then left the apartment with her body. Her family, with help of volunteers and community members, started searching several locations for Yanira's remains. Over 2 months later, on May 12th, detectives received data from Gastelum's cell phone leading them to where he went after leaving the apartment that night, which was a remote area off Highway 12 just outside Wauhula Junction, Washington. When authorities arrived at the location, they found her body in a sleeping bag covered with tree limbs and leaves. At this time, the medical examiner has not released the details on how Yanira died. However, Moses Lake police say that they found a large hunting knife that Gastelum threw away at a gas station and cadaver dogs detected human blood on it. He was arrested days later in Oregon, but fought extradition for 2 months before finally being extradited back to Washington state. He was charged with second-degree murder and second-degree rape following disturbing photos found on his cell phone. Documents also say Gastelum admitted to being physically abusive to Yanira, as two physical domestic calls were referenced from October 2021 and January 2022. On October 4, 2021, Yanira even requested a police report to get a restraining order against Gastelum. Gastelum had pleaded not guilty to both charges, and his next court appearance is scheduled for July 5, 2022. Yanira's three young children now live with their grandmother, Yanira's mother, Anna, and they deeply miss their mommy. On January 4, 1996, a woman called 911 and reported that a black man had broken into her apartment located at 2205 North Broadway Street in Santa Ana, California, and was stabbing her boyfriend. When police arrived, they found 22-year-old Christopher Hervey with multiple stab wounds. Tragically, Christopher would later die from his injuries. His girlfriend, Jade Binning, who he shared the apartment with, would tell police that she woke up at 3 a.m. to find Christopher struggling with the intruder. She said she tried to help but was slashed in the hand. Investigators would also speak with the neighbors who told police they'd heard a loud argument inside the apartment before police arrived. Detectives for this case told reporters at the time that it seemed like it was an attempted burglary gone wrong and nobody was arrested. The case went cold until January 2020, when investigators received an anonymous letter implicating Jade Binning for the murder of Christopher Hervey. After reopening the case, investigators found forensic evidence linking her to the crime. So on May 3, 2022, 26 years after his death, Binning, now a mother of three, was arrested by the Marshals Lone Star Fugitive Task Force near her home in Austin, Texas, and charged with his murder. Paul Joseph Franzak was born on April 26, 1964, to parents Dora and Chester Franzak. On the day of his birth and the next day, an unidentified nurse was seen walking around the maternity ward and at one point had peeked in on baby Paul. The day after Paul was born, that same woman dressed as a nurse entered their room at the Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago and said the doctor wanted to see the baby. Turns out, the woman was not a nurse and the baby was never returned. The woman was actually a kidnapper and habitual criminal. Soon after, the biggest manhunt in Chicago's history began. All they had was 2 photos of the newborn after birth, and he had not yet gotten a hand or footprint, and they did not know the baby's blood type and DNA was not being tested at this time. A cab driver recalled picking them up at the hospital and dropping them off at the intersection of 35th and Halsted in Chicago. The nearby residents were all questioned, but no sign of the woman and the baby was found. The case would eventually go cold until 14 months later when the Franzaks were contacted by the FBI. They said that a toddler found in Newark, New Jersey was abandoned in a stroller in a shopping center parking lot, and he resembled their son. They determined this by comparing the shape of the baby's ear to the newborn in the photo. The FBI also took pictures and even went as far as to create a mold of his ear for comparison. Over the next year, while the FBI was continuing their investigation, the baby was placed in the care of a very experienced foster family in New Jersey. Although there was no way to be sure at the time if he was indeed their child, they believed that he likely was. And eventually the FBI simply turned him over to the Franzaks for them to raise. Paul, unaware of the history of events at age 10, had always felt like he was someone else. Then one day, he went snooping in the basement for Christmas presents and found 3 boxes of newspaper clippings about the abduction. His mother was angry when he brought this up to her, so he decided not to mention it again. But they did explain that he had been abducted as a baby but was later found. Paul, who was nearly 50 years old and now living in Las Vegas, Nevada, was able to convince his parents to take DNA tests. He wanted to find out once and for all if he really was their biological son. In 2012, they agreed and he collected their DNA and sent the swabs off, but they suddenly changed their minds and begged him not to find out. But he wanted to pay them back for saving his life and being his parents by finding their biological son if it was indeed not him, and desperately wanted to know who he was. So he submitted the DNA test anyways, which answered the question that had burdened them all those years. He was not the Paul Franzak that Dora gave birth to. His parents were furious about the situation and refused to speak to him for several years before finally reconciling. Paul became determined to find the real Paul and answers about his own identity. With the help of genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, Paul was able to trace his genetic roots to Tennessee. She discovered that his birth name was Jack Rosenthal and he had 4 siblings, including a twin sister named Jill. Upon meeting his relatives, Paul learned that they had no clue what happened to Jill. Their birth mother, Marie, was a heavy drinker and his dad Gilbert was badly affected by the Korean War, and they were both now deceased. They allegedly removed photos of the twins from their family photo album, and the father warned relatives not to talk about them. As a result, their disappearances weren't reported. Jack and Jill were apparently badly neglected and abused, and one relative even recalled them being in a cage at one point when they were babies. At some point, Gilbert and Marie claimed that they had given the twins to another relative to take care of. Even with all this information, Paul still has no idea what happened to his twin sister Jill. In 2019, after Paul went public about his story and his desire to find his sister Jill and the real Paul Franczak, a Facebook page for tips was created which prompted the FBI to reopen the case. Genealogist C.C. Moore helped Paul track down biological relatives by submitting his DNA to 3 different companies. The connection started being made with a third cousin and then a second cousin and so forth. Paul would eventually discover his biological surviving siblings, but sadly they declined to connect with him. On his journey to find his twin sister, he has gone to prior addresses and dug up the backyard looking for bones and even used ground-penetrating radar. He did this because he initially suspected she had been murdered and that's why he was abandoned. So all his parents had to say was they were taken in together by another family. An artist created a picture of what Jill may look like in case she was also abandoned and grew up not knowing her true identity. But it's now believed that her disappearance is most likely related to foul play. Later briefly acted in movies and was a stand-in in the movie Ocean's 11. And later began working at a college. He decided to keep his name and went on to write a book titled The Foundling, a true story about his life. In 2014, an artist with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children created an aged progress photo of the baby in the picture to what he may look like around 50 years old. Meanwhile, several men came forward, believing themselves to be Paul. A friend of Sam Miller saw the photo and notified him that it looked very similar to him. He was the right age and grew up in a suburb of Chicago, and when comparing his baby picture to the stolen baby, they were strikingly similar. He also had been adopted and didn't find out until he was a grown man in need of a kidney transplant from a possible family member. He provided his DNA to the FBI, but he turned out not to be Paul Franczak. In 2015, C.C. Moore finally located the real Paul Franczak in rural Michigan. He had gone by the name Kevin Beatty his entire life and had been given the birth date March 14, 1964, weeks earlier than his true birth date. He was raised by Robert and Lorraine Fountain in the very small town of Menton, Michigan, and had spent his life working as a mold maker and machinist. He became the father of 3 daughters and later a grandfather of 4. His mother Lorraine died in 2004 and had reportedly told people that she dated a man in Chicago and returned to Michigan with an infant she had with the man. Turns out she had likely purchased him from the woman that kidnapped him. Sadly, Kevin, the real Paul, was suffering from cancer when he found out his true identity and passed away at the age of 56 on April 25, 2020. Before his death, he spoke to his biological mother on the phone a few times, but never met face-to-face. And he also learned that his biological father, Chester, was already deceased. Ironically, the day Kevin passed away was actually his 56th birthday. However, his obituary doesn't reflect that and shows the other birth date. Before passing away, Kevin got the chance to read The Foundling that Paul wrote. While it is said he did enjoy the book, he still declined to speak personally with Paul. The reason for this had a lot to do with the fact that he had terminal cancer, was dying in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and on top of all that, he just found out that he wasn't who he thought he was. As for the person who kidnapped Kevin, it's suspected to be a woman named Linda Taylor. A newspaper article was published in the 70s around the time that Linda was on trial for welfare fraud that said her ex-husband reported that she just showed up one day in the mid-60s with a newborn baby, and it was strange because she had not even been pregnant. Years later, Linda's son Johnny Harbaugh of Chicago, Illinois, claimed that his mother, who was notoriously known as the welfare queen in Chicago during the 70s and 80s, did in fact kidnap Paul right after he was born. Even President Reagan made a public statement about her slew of criminal actions in nearly 90 counts of fraud, aliases, and 50 false addresses. Johnny recalls that decades earlier, when he was a teenager, his mother just came home one day with an infant boy. He said she was a master of disguise and had multiple money schemes and even had an entire room for her wigs and nursing dresses and doctor's clothing that she used to disguise herself. He said he's certain one of her boyfriends later took the baby to Tennessee. The man worked for the American Revette Company, and a former employee there confirmed to the media that the man had moved to Sevierville, Tennessee. In 2021, an American-British documentary film titled The Lost Sons was released that follows the story of the kidnapping. In a new book, True Identity, Paul Franzak offers proof that the cops, FBI, and even the Franzaks were aware he probably wasn't the real Paul. Nadine Cohen Major was born on October 4, 1954 to parents Annette and Isaac Cohen. Nadine graduated Cleveland Heights High School in 1973 and then married a man named Mark Major. The couple lived in the small town of Willoughby, Ohio, in the 37,500 block of Grove Avenue, and had a son named Daniel. On January 11, 1980, a year and a half into their marriage, Mark left his job and returned to their apartment to find a devastating and gruesome scene. 25-year-old Nadine was found on the floor of the dining room, fatally stabbed, in a way described as severe overkill. Thankfully, their 6-month-old son was found unharmed in a playpen nearby, but had likely witnessed his mother's horrible murder. A neighbor reported that earlier that day, an unusual canary yellow sports car was parked outside the apartment building, and interestingly, her autopsy revealed no sign of sexual assault. Unfortunately, the case would go cold for the next 42 years. In 1996, the bloodied shirt Nadine was wearing was tested, and amidst her own blood, the crime lab discovered blood of an unknown male. Then in 2014, the lab analyzed the blood stain pattern on the shirt, and it was determined that the injured killer had likely stood over Nadine, dripping his blood onto her. But the case remained cold until finally they got a break thanks to advancements in DNA. In 2018, Parabon created a DNA profile using the suspect's blood. They created a snapshot that revealed the suspect's physical characteristics. He was a Caucasian man with blue eyes and blonde hair and of Eastern European descent. This information eliminated a lot of suspects off the investigators' list. Then a genetic genealogist began the tedious task of locating a possible suspect by creating and researching a family tree beginning all the way back to the 1800s. She came to the name of a likely suspect, Stephen Joseph Simcak, and provided his name to detectives. Simcak died in 2018, so his DNA could not be compared directly. So investigators discovered a grandson who had died before him, and the coroner's office still had that DNA, which they were able to test and ultimately conclude that Simcak was indeed the killer. Also, the lead investigator with the Willoughby Police Department reached out to Simcak's children, who agreed to provide their DNA on April 28, 2022. Again, this led to a match. Initially, no one knew who this man was and why he would want to murder Nadine, and police asked for anyone that might have information to come forward. Investigators were able to learn that Simcak owned a bright yellow Dodge Dart in 1980, which matched the car the neighbor saw. He also worked at Lincoln Electric, where old records showed that in the entire year, he had missed only one day, January 11th, the day of the murder. In fact, it was later determined that in his 36 years of employment at Lincoln Electric, he only caught in sick that one day. From what I've learned, no one can understand why a married man would take the day off from work to murder a woman he may not have known and leave no obvious signs of sexual assault as the motive. Police said that he had been married to the same woman since 1963 and had no criminal record. He was in the Marines in the late 1950s, lived on Sunset Drive in Eastlake from 1963 to 2002, the same city as the Major family. He then retired and lived in Bemis Point, New York from 2002 until his death. Daniel, now a grown man who was only 6 months old when he witnessed the murder of his mother, was angry that Simcak would not face justice and died a free man, and he took away ever being able to have a bond or hug his mother. On July 13, 2022, he and his father attended the press conference addressing Simcak's family, stating that he has no animosity towards them, but he surely does for Simcak, and told of the gruesome image that has stuck in his head all these years of his wife lying murdered on the floor, and said he hopes Simcak is rotting in hell for what he has done. Shani Warren was born in 1961 in Stoke Poges, England to parents Joe and Elsie and had a brother named Stephen. Shani was described as intelligent and level-headed and loved to sing and dance. She also came from a loving and wealthy family, and at the age of 26, she was living in Stoke Poges, Buckinghamshire. On the morning of Good Friday in 1987, Shani decided to mow her lawn and stopped by her uncle's house first, chatted and borrowed an extension lead for her lawnmower. She finished up her yard work at 5 p.m. and had plans to meet up with a friend. She was excited to meet up with her friend and had brought along an Easter egg and a bottle of champagne as it was Easter weekend, but sadly she would never make it. The next morning, Marjorie Arnold, along with her German Shepherd, took a stroll around Taplow Lake, Buckinghamshire. Her dog led her over to a deceased woman's body in a foot of water near the shore. Panicked, the woman ran to flag down a passing vehicle. Marjorie and the other person dragged the woman up the shore, hoping to perform CPR, but quickly realized she was way past being saved. She was gagged with a blue scarf and her hands were tied behind her back with jumper cables, and a rope was used to bind her feet. When police arrived to the scene, they searched a nearby car that contained bags of grass clippings and the driver's seat was found fully reclined. The car was a new black Cavalier and strangely would not go into gear. The body was soon determined to be that of Shani, and she was taken for an autopsy by pathologist Ben Davies, who had just been reinstated to the Home Office list of approved pathologists after being removed. Outrageously, despite being discovered gagged and bound with ligature marks around her neck and bruises on her body, he ruled her death a suicide because there was no sign of a struggle and no footprints were found with her stiletto shoe prints. He said he could provide 3 other samples of people who had gagged themselves before drowning themselves. It would be several more days before her death was treated as suspicious, which means the critical first 48 hours into her murder investigation had been lost. Even Detective Superintendent at the time, Tony Miller, suggested that she may have bound and gagged herself. The press would dub Shani the Lady of the Lake. Her family refuted this crazy theory along with others, which pressured law enforcement to call in a not expert. He reported that Shani could not have bound and gagged herself. Finally, law enforcement began investigating her death as a homicide and brought in their own expert, a forensic psychiatrist from Broadmoor Mental Hospital, Dr. John Hamilton. He reviewed over 8 years of Shani's diary and also went to the site her body was found. He stated there were no signs of depression or mental health disorders in any of her diary entries. With so much conflicting evidence, the coroner was left with no option but to record an open verdict. A reconstruction of her last movements was publicized on the BBC Crime Watch program, resulting in several tips. Several witnesses called to say that Friday evening they had seen a blind woman standing near the road while 3 men were looking at the engine of her car. Another witness had seen a blind woman with a black bag, possibly dumping grass clippings. At the same time, a well-dressed, unidentified man was standing next to a green BMW. 5 years after Shani's death, a conspiracy theory had developed. A British journalist named Collins on Computer Weekly published a book titled Open Verdict, which linked Shani's death to the technology giant G.C. Marconi. Collins had uncovered a series of up to 25 bizarre deaths of people connected to G.C. Marconi, who at the time was undertaking research for America's Strategic Defense Initiative or the Star Wars project. The project was designed to develop a system that could intercept Russian nuclear missiles from space. Collins began to record the mysterious disappearances and bizarre suicides of those connected to the company in the early 80s. At first, there were 1 or 2 deaths a year until 1988, when there was suddenly a cluster of them. Those who died showed no indication of mental illness before and had often spent the day performing mundane tasks before killing themselves in bizarre and dramatic ways. Their deaths were often recorded as an open verdict, same as Shani. Interestingly, Shani had began working for a company called Microscope, which was purchased a week prior to her death by none other than G.C. Marconi. Some of those identified by Collins had been on the verge of leaving their jobs. Others claimed to have uncovered a secret. At least 3 made appointments with their member of parliament to discuss a serious matter, but died before the meeting. The same day that Shani died, another person connected to G.C. Marconi jumped off a viaduct a mile away. Although he survived, He had no recollection of jumping or the events leading up to it. Then in 1997, 10 years after her death, a task force created by Lisshire Police, known as Operation Lynx, contacted Thames Valley Police. Lynx was set up when breakthroughs in DNA technology linked a series of rapes in Lisshire, Nottinghamshire, and Yorkshire. The rapist, M.O., was to abduct young women in parking lots, bind them with jumper cables or rope from their cars, then rape and rob them. In one instance, the suspect used a tube of super glue that he had found in the victim's car to glue her eyes shut. In another, he raped a young woman, placed a bag on her head, and tossed her into a freezing canal. Miraculously, she survived by standing on her tiptoes and crying for help. Moments away from drowning, she felt a stone on the floor of the canal that she used to push herself out of the water. I also read a report that stated that she was rescued by a citizen who heard her cries for help. Either way, her rapist watched calmly from the bank before walking away, and he was later identified as Clive Barwell, a lorry driver, or what we call a truck driver in the U.S. Over the years, police had gathered forensic evidence from the women and their cars, such as swabs and body hairs. Strangely, they later destroyed all the evidence, and he carried on with his attacks of young women, getting more and more bold and gruesome. A detective was able to place Barwell in Buckinghamshire around the time of Shunny's death, and he was charged with her murder but denied any knowledge of Shunny's death. In 1999, he pleaded guilty to attempted murder, kidnapping, rape and assault, and was sentenced to 8 life sentences. As you will see soon, he wasn't actually her killer, but he was a sadistic serial rapist who had attacked at least 25 women and had committed a reign of terror that lasted 13 years, all while his wife and children thought of him as a model citizen. In 2021, 33 years later, traces of semen were found on evidence collected from Shunny's body. The new DNA evidence led them to 66-year-old Donald Robertson, leading to his conviction for false imprisonment, indecent assault, and murder of Shunny. He was jailed in 1978 for burglary and attempted rape of a 15-year-old girl who was home alone. He was released 3 years later and soon after kidnapped and raped again. Days after being released, he attacked a 14-year-old girl who had been riding her bicycle in Farnham Royal. He shook a broken bottle at her and threatened to harm her again if she went to police. He later pleaded guilty to that crime in October 1981 and spent a little over 5 years in jail. For months after that release is when he attacked and murdered Shunny. Less than 2 months after attacking and killing Shunny, he attacked a 17-year-old girl who was walking home along the A4 Bath Road after missing the last train on the outskirts of Slough, Robertson's hometown. Robertson was convicted of another attack in 2010 and was already behind bars when convicted for Shaney's murder in May of 2022, over 34 years later.